Hello and welcome. Today I think it's finally time to edit another sunset picture. So I'm gonna take this very badly exposed sunset and I'm gonna turn it into a photo like this while explaining to you every single step I do. Before I start editing, I want to really mention that this is not a good exposure. You should really, if you have such a high contrast scene with a bright sky and dark foreground, dark shadows, you really should use 2 or 3 exposures and just blend them together in post. That really is not ideal how we have it here, but I'm going to show you that it's even possible to salvage such a bad exposure and really end up with a really cool picture. So I'm gonna make this a little bit more compact, not super long, so I'm gonna go straight away into the cropping, and I think there's a little bit too much to the left, so I'm just gonna crop away some of that left, and I think that works a lot better. So let's get started by raising the shadows and bringing down the highlights so we have a lot of detail in both highlights and shadows to work with. But as you can see, they're still a little bit too bright. This spot right here is a little bit too bright, so I'm just gonna grab a radial filter and bring down the exposure and highlights just for this radial filter in this portion right here, and just fine tune that so we really don't have anything overexposed and we have a nice and relatively even exposure. And we definitely need some pop in this picture, so I'm gonna bring down the shadows just a little bit and also raise the contrast, and I think that looks really great. Clarity, I really don't like to go plus clarity with my sunset pictures. I actually really like to go a little bit minus here just because it really works for most sunsets and definitely for this picture here. Then the whites, you usually want to bring them up and just stop before anything clips. So I think I might even go a little bit less than that. And we already have a pretty dynamic picture. Color temperature is another very important thing, especially for sunset pictures. Here I got the little trick, and that is just to go with a color temperature that both contains the blues but also contains the oranges in the picture. So don't go too blue where everything is just blue, and also don't go too warm where everything is just orange. That's a thing that a lot of people do, and I really think it's so much wasted opportunity because you can make such a interesting picture by just going in between and making sure that you both have a little bit of orange and also some blues in your photo. So once I've achieved that look, I think that works pretty well here. I'm gonna go down to tint and just bring it a little bit to the right, and I really like to add a little bit of magenta in my sunset pictures. It really works well for the mood. And actually, before I do anything else, I think there's a little bit too much foreground, so previously I've cropped in some of that left part, but now I'm actually gonna crop away some of that foreground just to have sort of a rule of thirds composition, at least with the horizon. And yeah, I think that works a lot better. It really was too much foreground. Then vibrance and saturation, I wouldn't go too crazy here because we can add a lot of color in the split toning a little bit later. But if you want to change any of this, definitely go with vibrance. Saturation makes everything look completely terrible. So if you want to change anything here, definitely go with vibrance. And the next tool is the tonal curve. A thing that I always like to do here is just bring up the highlights depending on how many bright parts in your photo you have. You might want to go a little bit less or more, really depending on the picture. And then I'm just gonna play around with the rest of these sliders. The rest of these tools really will be a lot quicker than the original basics adjustment. The basics adjustment is really by far the most important, so that's why I always like to take a lot of time there. But here, let's just finish up the tonal curve and point curve. Lastly, just see these contrast settings. This point curve really just affects the very minor contrast, so I'm just seeing if there works anything better, but at the end I think linear works pretty well. Before tonal curve adjustment, after. Just a little bit of a difference in this photo, but you know, depending on your picture, it might have a much bigger impact. HSL tool is not really a thing that I want to worry about right now. It really doesn't have a big impact, so I'm just gonna skip that. Split toning is a thing that is really important. I use it quite a lot of times in my usual pictures, but in sunsets that's even more important. So first thing you want to do is just go to highlights and open this little box, and then just go around, slide around with the different colors and see if there's anything you like. I know that's way too much saturation for any of these colors, but I really just want to see, you know, really see what it does to the picture and how it looks like. We can always adjust saturation in a second once we found the right color. So here, I definitely think I'm gonna go with an orangey look, probably a bit closer to the reds than the yellows, and that's a thing that I love to do in my sunset pictures. It really helps to give even more color, even more differentiation and dynamic in terms of color in your photo. So once you fine-tuned your color, you just want to go to the saturation slider and bring that down to a value that actually looks good. So let me see here. I don't think I'm gonna add too much here because we already have a lot of color. So let me just see, maybe around 20. Everything else is a little bit too much. So yeah, I think I'm gonna go, well actually a thing that you can do here as well is, for example, if it looks good with 20 saturation, you can try and go a little bit higher, for example 40 here, and then just go back to color temperature and just bring that down a little bit. That way you really get a very good mixture out of color, and you really can end up with a lot of different looks. In my tutorials I usually just go from one module to the other module and so on until I'm done, but in reality when I edit my own pictures I often just go from one to the top to the bottom, and really once you get to know Lightroom you really know how the different tools work in combination with each other, and that's definitely a thing that is very difficult to teach. That's definitely something you have to learn on your own, and that's also something you will just get by just practicing and editing pictures. So anyways, I think that works pretty well. I really liked a little bit of minus temperature that I've added here, and the exchange added a bit more saturation in the orange split toning. That way we really get the nice differentiation in terms of color, from kind of bluish purplish to medium yellow to very dark orange to almost reds. I like to fine tune the color a little bit later with local adjustments, but for now I think that looks really well. I'm gonna leave out shadows just because that doesn't have a very big impact and is not really needed, although you can definitely play around with it. I'm just gonna go straight away down to the detail tool, and here you definitely want to make sure that you zoom in 1:1 so you actually see what you do. And I really like to add sharpening in my pictures around 50 to 60. Now this will depend on your lens. I shot this with a Canon 18-55 kit lens on a Rebel T3i, which is a really inexpensive lens, but even if you have a very good lens, sharp lens, adding some sharpening can help in quite a lot of the cases. So I've added sharpening. I'm gonna zoom back out again, hold down the Alt key and bring the masking slider to the right, and that way I really just apply sharpening to the areas that are white highlighted. So I don't want to add too much sharpening in the sky or any non-textured surface, just because that would just introduce noise. I think that works pretty well. Let's go down to the color noise reduction, because that's a slider that I absolutely love. It's a really impactful and very powerful slider, and you should definitely take advantage of it. So I'm just gonna bring that to around 85. I think works pretty well here, and I'm not sure how well you're gonna be able to see it on video, but all of these dark parts and pretty much the whole pictures look so much cleaner. All of the purple and green color noise, sensor noise just goes away, and it really doesn't hurt the picture in any way. It's an amazing slider and I absolutely love it. So once again, here is the default and here is at around 85. Especially in the darker parts, you will be able to see it very clearly. And then the last slider is noise reduction. It's very different to the color noise reduction. Noise reduction really makes your picture look a lot more plasticky and takes away a lot of the sharpness and detail, so that's why I don't really like this slider very much at all. But if you have too much noise, this picture is just at the threshold, and I think I might have to add a little bit of noise reduction. So in this case, I really don't want to, but I'm afraid I have to add a little bit just because the picture is too noisy. So I think I'm done here with the detail tool. It won't make that big of a difference if you're just editing for Facebook or Instagram or whatever, but if you really want the highest quality and you print your picture, that is definitely something you will notice very much. Then the other tools, the other three tools are going to be rather quick here. Lens corrections. The two things I do here is just go on enable profile correction and choose my lens, and it will get rid of the distortion, and that's definitely a nice thing. And the second thing is go to color and just remove chromatic aberration. That will get rid of most of the purple and green fringing on the high contrast edges. For example, if you look at this tree right here, here is before and here is after. You see, it looks a lot cleaner, and that is definitely a tool you also want to take advantage of. Then down here at the effects, really just one thing you have to worry about, and that is vignetting. Vignetting helps to give more attention towards the center, and it makes the corners a little bit darker depending on how far you go. Now, you definitely don't want to do anything like that, but if you just go a little bit minus, that can often help to get a sense of even more mood for your picture, and really helps to give more attention towards the center. For example, here, I think I'm gonna go around minus 13 or something like that. Here is before vignetting, and here's after. Definitely completely optional, but I think it's worth to play around with, and I really like it in quite a lot of my pictures. Especially I found if you have a very kind of darkish mood in your photo, it works even better. And then down here at camera calibration, the last tool, we have profiles for the first part, and that's definitely a thing you want to play around with, and just go over all of these profiles, and that will just change the color, the highlights, the contrast, all of these little things. It will just change the basic appearance of your photo, and that can have a very big impact. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does, so I definitely would suggest you to play around with it. Let me just see if I like anything better than the Adobe standard. Camera neutral doesn't look too bad. Camera portrait is way too much for my taste. I actually think I like the camera's landscape a little bit better than the Adobe standard, just in terms of the general look, but I think it's definitely making the picture too oversaturated, so I'm just gonna go to vibrance that I've previously added and just bring that actually down into the minus a little bit. And you know, sometimes you really have to go back up to some adjustments you did previously because you adjust something down there. It's really ever changing, and you really have to combine these different tools to really get the perfect effect and the best possible look. So let's go into the history so I can actually show you. Adobe standard is where we started off with, and that is before any additional vibrance change. I really just have the one that I've added at the start, and here is what the look that I've ended up with by just choosing the camera landscape profile and just reducing the vibrance. So I think at the end it's a better look. I like it a little bit better, but of course at the end you have to decide for yourself. And actually I think I might go just a little bit into the minus exposure just to get back some of that dark and really sunset mood. I'm not quite sure if you can follow along here. I really think I make this way more complicated than it actually is, but I hope you get my point. And the last thing that you have in global adjustments is primary color sliders. This is something that I'm actually gonna adjust it here because this is a very colorful picture, but in my general pictures I often like to just leave it out just because the impact isn't that great. Even in such a colorful picture, but even less in a less colorful picture than this right here. But this will just change the color of your photo, of course. You don't want to go too far with any of these sliders, really, but just playing around with it, you might end up with a little bit of a better color and a better look that you like better. I'm really going to do that really quick here. If you do that for the first time, definitely be sure to take some time and really see what it actually does. So I'm just gonna show you quickly before any of these primary color adjustments. Here's before and here is after. Really such a minor difference, and you know, in most of the cases, even in such a colorful picture, it won't have that big of an impact. So I think I'm really done with the global adjustments, and now comes local adjustments, which really is the fun part. Here you really can customize your photo and really make it truly unique and get the little nits and crannies and to make them really the best possible way. So first thing I always start off with is graduated filters. Now there are so many uses for graduated filters. It would be impossible to explain everything in one video, but I am going to just drag one over the sky, very soft edge here, and the reason I'm doing that is just so I can go to the color temperature and go a little bit of minus here to make the upper portion of the sky a little bit more blue, and just fine adjust the position of the slider, and also adjust the color temperature to really end up with what I actually like. And yeah, so that way before and after we really have an even more distinctive differentiation between blues and the oranges, which is a thing that I really think works best, and I'm actually gonna go even further with it by just grabbing a new one and dragging it over the very top so it affects even less of the sky than this one down here. So I'm gonna go to the very top one and just adjust the color temperature even more. By the way, you can go here into color as well and just, you know, even adjust it more. I really just want to keep it relatively short, but that way you can get so many different tones of color in your sky, in your picture, and I really think that works wonders for sunsets. You know, a lot of people just go for like a very warm mood like this, and at the end they don't really have any differentiation and not really any interest in terms of color. So I think that works pretty well. Then another thing that I really like to do is grab another graduated filter and just go over the very top here, make a sort of a harsh edge, and then just go down in exposure, and that way you really get to close out the picture. I'm gonna grab another one and do the same thing with the very bottom of the photo right here, and also bring down the exposure, and that way you really get a sense of your eye being in the photo and really being contained there. Then another thing that I might want to do is just grab another graduated filter and drag it over one part of the sky. Now this makes more sense if you don't have your actual sun in the photo, but even if you do, you can just grab a very big graduated filter over pretty much one side of the photo. Just be sure that you have a very soft edge, and then just go a little bit into the plus exposure, grab another one and bring it over the other part of your photo, also with a very soft edge. Let me just fine tune that here, and this time just go into the minus exposure. And you really don't want to do this too much, but the idea here is really to create even more differentiation in the lighting and, you know, make one side a little bit darker than the other, and that way you really get a dynamic and interesting picture. And once again, because we have the sun in the photo right here, you don't want to make it too much, otherwise it looks unnatural, but if you just do a little bit, it really can improve your picture. So let me just show you before any graduated filters and after, and you see we have a much more color, much more differentiation, and much more interest between before and after. Really very important thing to work with these graduated filters. And actually, I'm not done with the graduated filters yet. I just kind of looked at the picture and I thought the overall exposure is still a bit too even, so I'm gonna grab another pretty big one just over the front part, the bottom of this photo, and go a little bit down in exposure, so that way we really get a sense of the sun shining on the scene and it makes everything even more dynamic. So, but now I really think I'm done with the graduated filters. Once again, here before and here is after. Then a thing that is definitely needed for this photo in particular is the trees are just too dark, so I'm gonna fix that by just grabbing an adjustment brush and bringing up the shadows and bringing up the exposure a little bit as well. And you want to make sure that the feather is to 100 and that your density and flow is to 100. Very important to get a natural look. And then I'm just gonna paint over this tree right here. Now this is a thing, you know, you will get a much better effect if you just use exposure blending, but if you just have one exposure and you want to work with that, it is something that you can work with and really get some dark parts, for example in this tree, and make everything a little bit brighter and a little bit more alive and look a little bit nicer. So I'm gonna do this rather quickly for this tutorial. If you do this in person for your own photo, you definitely want to make sure that you fine tune that and really maybe even zoom in 1:1 so you really don't select too much of the sky. But I'm gonna do it rather quick. And by the way, you can press down the Alt key and with that you get a minus adjustment brush where you can remove effects on certain parts of the image that you previously added. Really nice, for example here, if I go a little bit too far over the edge. So I'm gonna fine tune that, the exposure here. And let's just press O to actually see the mask, and that can make it even easier to do the adjustment. Press O again to get rid of the mask and maybe even add a little bit of tint in this picture. Make it a little bit kind of like a Japanese tree. I think that works pretty well here. Once again, if you do this for yourself, you really want to take some time and really maybe even zoom in 1:1. I think that works pretty well. Then let me grab another one and pretty much do the same thing just on the areas where it needs even more exposure. And let's just see, maybe even more plus shadows, and maybe even grab another one. I know this is kind of tedious and takes a little bit of time, but I really want to at the end get a good picture and even brush over the parts that need even more exposure. So I think that works kind of okay for this relatively fast-paced video that I'm doing here. And at the end, maybe even a little bit more on this tree right here. I mean, this is not something that I would suggest you to do with your regular picture, but if you have a very dark thing, for example a tree like this in your picture, I think it can make a very big difference. So let me just finish up here. And yeah, I definitely think I am done here, just to kind of once again keep it short. Here's before that adjustment and here's after. Once again, really have to fine tune that, but you get the rough idea. Before and after looks a lot more pleasant. And another thing that I like to do with the adjustment brush is just to grab another one and go a little bit into the minus exposure, and this time really grab a big size adjustment brush and just try to add a little bit more custom vignetting on some of these corners to really see if it works. If it doesn't, you can really just reset it or fine-tune it. But I think it works actually pretty well here, maybe a little bit more over the left portion. And yeah, so I think the picture looks pretty good, and the last thing that I always do with my pictures is just grab a radial filter and add some dodge and burning. Dodge and burning means making individual parts of the image darker or brighter. I'm just gonna grab a radial filter and drag it over the photo right here and just bring up the exposure a little bit. And just drag it over here. You can also mix that with color, for example, a bit of orange. And the idea here is really to complexify the light and make everything, the whole kind of boring scenes, a little bit more interesting. And you really can play around with that and see at the end if it works. If it doesn't work, just delete it. But I'm gonna add a little bit more here. Also gonna change up the size. And I think non-negative exposure filters are needed in this photo, but here is before and here is after. In some cases it really has a bigger difference, but I still think it's a little bit better than before, although this filter might be a little bit too prominent. I really think I'm done here. It really was actually a way longer tutorial than I previously intended. Here is the picture before any editing. Yeah, right there. And you see it's a completely different picture. Really not usable how it is. And this is what we've made out of it once Lightroom loads. And yeah, you get the idea. It looks a lot more dramatic, a lot more colorful, and a lot more usable. Once again, in this tree, you really have to fine-tune that stuff. I really did a very sloppy job, but you get the idea of how the picture looks. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more videos just like this one, like or dislike the video accordingly, and as always, thanks for watching and have a great day.